Recently, I went over a list of PS1 games people suggested to me that I just straight up missed growing up. You can check that video out here. Thanks, like, and subscribe! It was a lot of fun to check out those games for the first time, but my bread and butter of this channel has always been waxing nostalgic about my childhood favorites, so it was only a matter of time before I had to discuss some games I did play and loved. But I wanted to take kind of a similar approach as I did in that other video, where I focus on less popular games that haven't been remade or re-released in other ways on other systems. So again, no Spyro, no Final Fantasy, no insert game here that's probably your go-to favorite. They aren't necessarily underrated games, it's just ones that have probably been forgotten to time, or at least weren't popular enough for companies to cash in on the nostalgia, since it seems like literally everything is being remade these days. Before everything on this list gets remade and renders this video irrelevant, since it's already kind of late, let's get on to the first game. This one kinda hurts, honestly, because I remember it being one of my favorite fighting games back in the day, alongside Soul Edge and Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Anytime friends came over, we'd do a few battles, and it evoked similar feelings to Smash Bros. Would a few years later. But man, going back to this is pretty rough. For one, the presentation alone is pretty rough. The cutscenes during story mode are weirdly clunky, and the voice acting is, well...
Oh my god! The village! Hilda! On Hilda!
Let's call it unnecessary, to be polite, because I'd rather play with the audio off. There are still some really cool ideas at play here, though, since every character feels distinctly unique with their different elemental attacks, and the more top-down 3D maps and free-roam movement separate it from other fighting games in kind of a fun way. The problem is that it all ends up feeling pretty shallow in practice. There's essentially two different attacks per character, a light and a heavy, that changes whether you're melee or ranged. This seems like a cool idea, but there's just not enough to it to make use of the differences between each character, and since some of the attacks are also homing, most of the matches just end up being two people flinging elemental blasts at each other from across the map until one dies. It was fun and flashy when I was a kid, but now it just got old after a few matches. The meat here should be in the story mode, but aside from the bad cutscenes,
Zauber has a great army. You don't stand a chance against him alone.
It's really just more of the same. To reiterate, there's nothing inherently bad about this game. It's just unmemorably generic. Which is ironic because I vividly remember enjoying it as a kid, even though it took a lot of work to actually find it because I forgot the title and couldn't describe it well enough on Google to look it up at first. That should have been my first clue that it wasn't going to hold up, I guess, huh? Okay, I know I don't need to say much here. Pretty much everyone knows what Harvest Moon is as a series, but this game in the series gets a special nod because A, it's the best Harvest Moon game. Don't at me. It seriously still holds up, and Mineral Town in general is the most smartly laid out game world in this series. That's why other games in the series keep using it. And B, this is one of the first games my wife and I bonded over when we first met, so it holds a special place in my heart on top of just being a fantastic game. And speaking of Mineral Town, I know what everyone is probably saying. This video is about games that haven't been remade, and not only is there the GBA game Friends of Mineral Town, but also an upcoming Switch game called Story of Seasons Return to Mineral Town that was announced after I originally came up with this list, but luckily you're all sitting around watching this after I made it, so I don't have to take your opinions into account. But I'll refute them anyway. Friends of Mineral Town isn't technically a port or remake of this game, as it has enough changes to the gameplay, romance options, and holidays that it's considered a different game that takes place in the same region. As for Return to Mineral Town, we don't know enough about it, but there's been rumors that it's actually a sequel using the modern Story of Seasons mechanics, not a remake, since the original creators can't make games in the Harvest Moon series anymore. So there. Anyway, now that we've gotten that ridiculous pedantic chatter out of the way, let's discuss why this game still rocks. It's a simpler time for Harvest Moon, before all the gimmicks of later games that somehow manage to overstuff what you have to do in a day, while also slowly trickling out those new features over the first 2 years of in-game time, making it a chore the first few years. But this one, on the other hand, gets everything right that makes Harvest Moon great without all that extra bloat and chunky 3D issues later entries had. It's essentially PlayStation's Majora's Mask to Harvest Moon 64's Ocarina of Time, where it reuses the same romance options and other villagers, as well as the same visual style, for a totally different game. But honestly, while a lot of the things are similar, it really is Mineral Town that makes this game special. I don't even know how to explain it. It's just a quaint, small city with a cool town square in the middle, and it's just satisfying to explore. Whereas a lot of Harvest Moon games have towns that are too disorganized and spread out, so you spend way too much time of your day just getting around. This game, though, combines the best town with all the same iconic holiday celebrations, farming and animal raising, and the best group of romance options. I will always love you, Karen. At least you're not an alcoholic in this game. Take that, Harvest Moon 64. Potpourri is great too, but she's better on 64, so Karen still wins my heart for this one. Back to Nature is dope. Play it. Or just wait for Return to Mineral Town for the Switch. I know my wife and I are excited. Or play both! Moving on. Alright, this is another one that kind of upsets me how bad it is. To be clear, I put it on myself this time because I decided to go with Enter Electro instead of the first Spider-Man game, which holds up a little better, though it still uses the same janky engine, so it's not great. But in my defense, Electro is my second favorite Spider-Man villain behind Mysterio, and the first Spider-Man was also on N64, even if that version wasn't as good, so I wanted to go with the one that's unique to the PS1. And man, it's rough. It has some elements that are kind of clever, but almost all of them are just ripped out of the first game, and anything new to this game is glitchy and not fun. Like a level where you have to stop a fire by ripping off a fire extinguisher, but it barely works, so it's just an exercise in frustration as you restart the level over and over just to have it not work each time. If I wanted to watch Spider-Man fail this much, I'd just follow the Sony and Disney negotiations closer. That joke probably won't age well. Anyway, the worst thing about this part of the game, for me, is to know the objective of a level, but for the game to actively and unfairly work against you completing that objective. And that happens a lot in this game. Just like a later level, where you have to wall crawl up a giant chasm, but keep getting electrocuted and falling back down. There's supposed to be platforms along the way that stop your fall, but it's ridiculously easy to miss every single one of those platforms, which is more and more maddening the closer you get to the top. And by the way, that's the whole level. Someone actually thought, hey, this is a mechanic we can milk for an entire level, right? People will love it! But no, we don't. It's not good. The more traditional platforming and combat levels are just as good as the first game, but there's so few of those, and it's the fact that it tries so much to mix things up in bad ways that makes the game utterly frustrating. That being said, there's one element that slightly redeems this game: the Unlockables. The coolest thing about this game is not only the sheer amount of costumes you can unlock, and the weirdly obscure pulls they went for, but also the Create a Spider feature that lets you choose whichever costume you want, and then add in various buffs pulled from any of the costumes. It feels like such an innovative feature for the time, especially considering Spider-Man PS4 kind of has that same feature of dissociating the powers from the costumes, so you can just pick your favorites. Unfortunately, in this game, it's about the only thing that makes it playable, by kind of giving you a god mode, if you will. The game also kind of wastes Electro, as he's not that prominent in the actual game, and the final battle is clunky, to say the least. I actually remember liking this game as much as the first one when I was a kid, other than being a little short, as I beat it over a weekend as a Blockbuster rental. But now, I'm a crotchety old man with a cynical brain and can only see the terrible gameplay gimmicks shoved into each level. I need to start this one off with an admission. I never played a Breath of Fire game before this one. To clarify, I probably randomly tried one or two as an SNES ROM back when I was dabbling with literally every game as a kid, but I don't remember devoting time to any game in the series before this one. So why is it on here? Because it's f***ing amazing, obviously. If I missed something with the first three, feel free to let me know, but I didn't notice any issues with just jumping in here, and man, probably more than 15 years since I first played it, this game still holds up just as well. For one, it's beautiful. There's something about this 2.5D art style that has aged extremely well. Final Fantasy Tactics is another example. I wish more PS1 games used this style. But also, the gameplay is extremely satisfying. I will say, the camera can be funky sometimes, especially in towns where there's a lot to try to look for, but the exploration is more interactive than a lot of RPGs, and the battle system is fairly traditional but has a lot of different abilities to use in battle, especially when you take the character transformations into account. There's also some cool mini-games to help mix things up, even if some of them are frustrating and expensive to the point where I wish they weren't mandatory. I've never actually beaten this game, so I don't know where all the story goes by the end, but I do remember it being really interesting, and even when I replayed for footage, set up some intriguing mysteries that I vaguely remember paying off beautifully. This is one of those games I honestly wish I had more to say about, but it's another one I only rented growing up, so while I loved my time with it, I never got back into it until now, and I couldn't justify spending probably 40 plus hours to beat it just for this video, but I'm definitely planning to beat it. Especially now that I can play it effectively again, as I don't think it was ever made available on PSN or anywhere else since, so this is literally the first chance I've had to play it again since I had my PS1 as a kid. So just enjoy this tease of a genuinely great game, and then check it out for yourself if you can find it. This was actually one of the first games that I was excited to try again when I got my PlayStation Classic. Once again, it was just a rental. I can't reiterate enough that I was a poor kid and generally just rented games for weekends at my dad's house to get me through, and this is one of the few I got him to actually play with me, and I remember it being a lot of fun, especially in co-op. Maybe it is better as co-op, honestly, but the actual gameplay is so hard and cheap. Probably because it was built for arcades, so it had that stereotypical thing where if you game over, you have to almost start all the way over. And there's not even close to enough health or lives to get through the whole game, so I don't think a second player would offset the challenge that much. It's not all bad though. It's pretty great that you can play as different fan-favorite characters from Episode 1, as well as a few that no one remembers, and it's nice they made the effort for them to all animate a little different. But I'm upset that Mace Windu doesn't use his purple lightsaber, and the unforgiving arcade-style progression system with clunky controls and slow animations kills it for me. Also, the janky level designs don't do the game any favors, with plenty of instant kill, precise jumps, and ridiculously stupid platforming sections. Like this. Why this? Being a Jedi will never not be cool, but aside from some sometimes satisfying lightsaber combat, this game is just a nice novelty for a bit before it gets old and unfair. Honestly, after the initial, hey cool, I have a lightsaber, this game pretty much still becomes arguably less fun than actually watching Episode 1, and that's saying something.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Oh my God, who the hell cares?
The Mana series gets a lot of crap, especially lately as it hasn't had a proper game since Dawn of Mana on the PS2, and no, I don't count the spin-offs or remakes, because for the most part, those have also been bad. I'm looking at you, Secret of Mana 3D. I am excited for the Trials of Mana remake, because that looks like it's made with love, but that's beside the point, for now. The point is, the Mana series had a long period of irrelevancy until recently, when it finally started to play off its own nostalgia again, though still without any good new games. I personally think it hit its peak though, with the PS1 and Legend of Mana. This game surprisingly wasn't reviewed that well, but I obviously didn't know that as a kid because I couldn't get enough of it. The main problem, I guess, was the non-linear approach to its storytelling, but this honestly seemed like a logical progression to me from Trials of Mana, since that game also has multiple protagonists and different intro and ending sections for each one. I don't understand why that would be critically panned, when Chrono Trigger, among other critically acclaimed games, have multiple endings that require you to do multiple playthroughs to see everything. At least this game actually makes each playthrough different without all the added randomness of roguelikes, which I'm not a huge fan of. The actual gameplay is pretty similar to past Mana games, with the radial of abilities and simple but satisfying hack-and-slash combat, so there's really nothing to say about that. But the story is really intriguing as you slowly unveil the whole thing across multiple playthroughs, since certain quests aren't available on those initial playthroughs. I will say the game isn't perfect, since each run is fairly short, and not every area you put down is different in each run, so there are some moments of repeating the same stuff over and over again. But that's true of any game with replay value. I haven't played Nier Automata, nor do I know how to say that, but I've heard it's similar in a way, where some stuff you have to straight up replay, but each run has a lot of new content also to get the full game. And that game is well loved too. Legend of Mana doesn't get enough respect. That's all I'm saying. Let's get a remake of that if Trials of Mana crushes it. There's so many games out there that are Mario Kart knockoffs. One of the most iconic ones of all time, actually, is also on PS1, though I was never a big fan of the Crash series in general, so Crash Team Racing didn't do much for me. This game, though, really hit me as a child. I think largely because I loved everything to do with Legos as a kid, and still, honestly. So being able to build your own racer, car, and more was a major draw to me, even though I remember the racing itself just being okay back then. But I gotta say, even those building elements haven't held up well. The racer customization is harmless, if not a little cool in the novelty, but building a car is somehow even worse than creating a gummy ship in Kingdom Hearts, which I didn't think was possible. Like, there's no reason for how obtuse the controls are in this mode, where just something as simple as trying to swap out the wrong part with a different one can take upwards of a minute if you don't know what you're doing. It's bad, and not even really worth the trouble, since most custom cars don't control as well as the pre-made ones until you start unlocking better car blocks later in the game, but you also unlock new cars as you go, so it kind of evens out. But when you get into the actual tracks, there's some interesting aesthetics at least, even if the actual Legos don't seem to play into the tracks at all. Like, this is where there could have been cool stuff to interact with and break or build mid-race. But they're pretty generic takes on LEGO playsets, like castle, forest, space, etc. There are some shortcuts that mostly open up through breaking scenery with projectile power-ups, but that's in most other racing games too. They didn't even do anything extra to establish it as a LEGO racing game in that regard. Speaking of power-ups, they're handled kind of interestingly, as you combine the same color of power-ups to get stronger versions of that type of power-up, so a regular missile might become a homing missile, or a boost might become, well, a stronger boost. This is different from most other racers because you can guarantee yourself the type of power you get instead of it being random every time, but that one mechanic isn't enough to make this game stand above the rest, even though it does add some cool strategy. I would love to see what a modern take on a LEGO racing game looks like though, as the LEGO games lately have done a lot of creative things with the brand, and I think a new one could actually set itself apart aesthetically to look more like levels made out of Legos and take more risks. But I would hope they bring back that same cool power-up system, because that's the one unique thing at play here, and they removed that from the sequel to this game, weirdly. All in all, this game is serviceable, but not worth playing when there's other, better racers. Whoa, we're halfway there. Whoa, gonna end it here. That might be my worst outro joke. I'm embarrassed. Come back soon for the next 7. Sorry. So sorry. You can like and subscribe or whatever if you want, but you probably won't anymore. Just tell me in the comments if there's any games you're hoping to see on the next video. Or just tell me how stupid I am. I deserve it. Okay, bye. waiting for it to scroll. At least you're not an alcoholic in this game. Take that, Harvest Moon 64. This part's like a weird flex against alcoholism. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm leaving it in. Like, yeah, suck it, alcohol.